echo to the least footfall. Museum without statues, grand with pillars, porticos, rotundas. In my courtyard a fountain leaps and sinks back into itself. None hurted and blind to the world. Marble lilies o' the world exhale their pallor like scent. I imagine myself with the great public. Mother of a white Nike and several bold-eyed Apollos. Instead, the dead injure me with attentions, and nothing can happen. Red-faced and mum as a nurse. Analysis. The poem narrates the story of a woman who can't conceive and feels empty. Line 1. The narrator, here, refers to a life without splendor. She considers herself a museum without statues. An empty museum is of no use. Similarly, a barren woman also fails to fulfill what is often expected of her, i.e., reproduction. The narrator feels that bearing children would invite her praise and positive attention. She imagines herself as mother of a white Nike and several bold-eyed Apollos so that she finds acceptance with the great public. However, at the same time, she accepts the reality and exclaims, "Nothing can happen." Towards the end of the poem she is probably at the doctor's for treatment for infertility. In a nutshell, Plath's Barren Woman deals with the theme of infertility where a woman is considered a social outcast for the same. The anxieties conveyed through these poems no longer hinge on the choice between motherhood and poetry. Instead, these poems express fears of sterility, both the literal and literary barrenness. Written one after the other in 1961, although only one appears in the Ariel collection, the poems, Heavy Women and Barren Woman, clearly demonstrate the juxtaposition of fertility and infertility. In Barren Woman, Plath takes a step back from a complete association of childlessness with death. Rather, bearing in mind the subtle difference, a sense of lifelessness pervades this poem. Sterility is not represented by death itself, but by the trappings of death. The emptiness felt by the speaker due to her inability to produce children, or poetry, plays out in the stark landscape of a mausoleum, a museum without statues. The speaker expresses the futility of trying to create in this state, since any creative force that springs from her only leaps and sinks back into itself. Nothing can happen. Instead, she can only imagine herself mothering a white Nike and several bold-eyed Apollos to populate her empty home. Similar to the poem, Two Sisters of Persephone, in the speaker's imagination, her offspring are rendered as mythic figures, meaning that, dream as she may, the speaker's ability to create is as unattainable as myth. It figures that, given her artistic reproductive stagnation, the children of her dreams take on the forms of Nike, goddess of victory and success, and Apollo, god of arts and poetry. Barren Woman expresses a deep-seated fear of both poetic and reproductive infertility, both of which result in the same bleak hellscape of loneliness and tedium. In contrast, Heavy Women depicts a much more optimistic scene. The first major difference between this poem and the last is the absence of the lonely I. The women of this piece serve as models for the observer-speaker to appreciate. By situating these women as objects worthy of an external speaker's admiration, Plath confirms that these pregnant women exemplify the ideals of femininity, reinforcing her positive portrayal of fertility. The association with ideal femininity is enhanced by allusions to Venus and Mary. By comparing the women to Venus, pedestaled on a half-shell, the women are exalted to a mythic, divine status, and describing their clothing as Mary blue aligns them with notions of idyllic, saint-like motherhood. The fertile women are revered in this poem for their ability to physically produce the life. In their pregnant state, they live regally, waited on and free to idle as they meditate devoutly as the Dutch bulb forming its 20 petals, awaiting the emergence of their creation. Whereas the nothing of barren woman holds the speaker against her will and stunts her creativity, nothing is a choice in this poem. In their free time, these women loop wool, doing nothing in particular, at leisure to step among the archetypes, which hints at a correlation between women's reproductive fertility and their creative fertility. In their idle time, the women are free to create and choose their archetypes, lending them a sense of authorial control with which they can selectively compose their art. Plath fully exhibits an altered perspective of motherhood in these poems, in which the ability to birth a child is analogous to the ability to create entirely, including poetry. These poems showcase the progression of Plath's work as she moves towards deserting her preconceived notions of the dichotomous woman in order to fuse the creator mother and the creator poet into a singular voice.